Okay, people are slowly entering the room, so I will start speaking while the room fills up. Welcome to the webinar on military use of emerging and evolving technologies in current conflicts and current developments. This is an IFSH event, so by the Institute of Peace Research and Security Policy, the University of Hamburg, which is part of the German Forum on Security Policy. And we are very happy and grateful that it was possible to organize this event, and grateful for the coordination by the Federal Academy for Security Policy. I'm grateful to welcome you here. My name is Anja Dahlmann. I am the head of the Berlin office of the IFSH, and also a researcher there working on autonomous weapons and the regulation thereof. We have a great set of speakers today, and I'm very happy to introduce them in a second, just to give you an idea why we are actually doing this event, what's our motivation. We all of us basically work on new technologies and arms control issues and think about how the next wars will be fought and think about imaginaries of future warfare and all that. And today we want actually to do kind of a reality check of what is actually possible and what is currently deployed in the field, what not, and what does that mean for current conflicts. One word of caution, and to balance that, we talk about war, we talk about terrible atrocities, basically in a very analytical way. And I think it's always important to keep in mind that we're talking actually about humans being killed in the most horrible ways in the battlefield. And just to remind us all that the ultimate goal must be to avoid wars and strengthen international humanitarian laws if wars happen. So I really want you to keep that in mind when we talk in a rather neutral and analytical way about these issues and current events. And with that, I would like to introduce our three speakers who will talk about three aspects of emerging and evolving technologies. We deliberately didn't name it new technologies because many of those technologies aren't actually new, but kind of evolving in their use and kind of deployment. We will start with Dr. Mischa Hansel, who is a researcher at the Institute for Peace Research and Security Policy, and also the head of the project or research focus International Cybersecurity. And not surprisingly, he will speak about cyber attacks and cybersecurity. He will be followed by Andrea Rotter from the Hanns-Seidel-Foundation, and there she's the head of division on foreign and security policy, and if I might add, one of the leading German experts on security issues in space. So I'm very happy to have you here, Andrea, to enlighten us regarding the space dimension of current conflicts. And last but not least, we will have Neil Renic, also from the IFSH, a researcher there who focuses on future of warfare, new technologies, and uncrewed weapon systems and autonomous weapon systems. And that's why he will talk about basically drones and loitering munitions, and maybe a bit of autonomy in there as well. We will see. One part of this discussion will also be to basically destroy some myth and weird ideas going on about technology and what's currently possible. So you will be very disillusioned at the end of this event, just to manage expectations there. A few housekeeping notes before Mischa starts with his presentation. Feel free to follow up with questions to our speakers. It can be really basic questions like, what does that term actually mean? Feel free to do that, but of course you can also ask about details. You can type your questions in the Q&A section that you should be able to see. We disabled the chat function, but you can add all the comments and questions in the Q&A part, and this little box you should see there. I think maybe a few people will join later on. I think we had about 100 registrations, about half of them now. As you can see, the meeting is recorded, it's being recorded right now, and we will post it on the IFSH YouTube channel. And there is also the link to it. Please feel free to follow the channel as well. And with that, I think I will just hand over to Mischa and the cyber dimension.
Yeah, thank you so much, Anja, for this nice introduction, and thank you for the opportunity to participate in this panel, in this discussion. Starting my presentation, and hope you can see it. Okay. All right. So my role is to focus on cyber attacks and cybersecurity within the context of the ongoing Ukraine war. Of course, it's too early to tell a lot of things, and we need to be cautious not to overgeneralize, but I will come to this argument in a couple of minutes again. I'd like to start with focusing and with making some remarks on the military and strategic significance of cyber operations in this war. And I think it's fair to say that the picture is quite ambivalent in this regard, because on the one hand, we have serious cyber incidents. For example, we have a series of wiper attacks against Ukrainian governmental organizations, but also businesses. So wiper malware actually overwriting data, making systems permanently unusable. And these attacks started even before the Russian invasion. So there's a number of wiper attacks going on, affecting thousands of systems. Now, the question might be, what is the strategic significance of these attacks? So if the intent was, for example, to erode public trust in Ukrainian organizations, then I would say the goal was, they failed to achieve their goals. We have also seen a number of more selective attacks, specifically targeting some critical communication services used by Ukrainian military. And I will talk about the KSAT incidents in a couple of minutes. But also I think Andrea will definitely cover this as well as a space security expert. Then there was at least one incident where an attack was obviously meant to cause physical damage. Around about 4 weeks ago, an attack by Sandstorm, one of those groups closely affiliated with Russian intelligence services, attacking high voltage electrical substations. But the puzzle actually would be, why only a few of these kind of attacks? And part of the explanation might be quite simple, that Russian military forces are preferring kinetic force. And they are willing to use, obviously, to use physical violence on a massive scale without regard of international law, and particularly international humanitarian law. Once you're willing and ready to use physical violence to this degree and on this scale, basically cyber operations are a second best option, if at all, because cyber operations are far less reliable and far less efficient when it comes to the destruction of critical infrastructures. So to destroy like city centers, energy grids, water supply, whatever, by bombs and artillery is way easier and far more reliable. There's another interesting aspect, as we don't have clear evidence of a close coordination between Russian troop movements and cyber attacks. So it doesn't seem that cyber operations are a closely integrated component within the overall military campaign, at least when we look at the evidence that we have right now. And finally, there's also no evidence of deliberative attacks against NATO countries, against critical infrastructures within NATO countries. I'm not talking of DDoS attacks, website defacements, but really critical infrastructure. And deliberative is, of course, an important qualifier. I'll come back to this in a couple of minutes as well. So overall, the strategic military significance of cyber operations seems to be rather limited right now. So then the question is, does this mean we do not need to care about or do not need to worry about cyber operations in the future? And I would say no, because on the one hand, of course, strategic circumstances matter. I already highlighted or emphasized the Russian willingness to use physical violence in a non-discriminatory way. There's also, I would say, no plausible interest right now on Russia's part to internationalize the conflict even further by attacking critical systems within the West. But this might change, of course. So circumstances might change, strategic interests might change, and perhaps most important, these particular strategic circumstances do not easily, cannot be easily transferred to other conflicts. in the future. So we need to be very cautious not to overgeneralize what we have seen. And then even when, or if we take a closer look on some of these cyber incidents within the Ukraine war, then there is lots of evidence supporting the notion that cyber operations come with particular escalatory risk. And in particular, they seem to, at least potential, dramatically reduce escalation control. And I will walk through some of these incidents in the remainder of my presentation. So, yeah, I already mentioned KSAT, which is a satellite-based internet service. So there's users across Europe, also Northern Africa, using these services. One of the users has been the Ukrainian military. This, of course, is the reason why Russia, on the very first day of the invasion, attacked the system in the first place, of course. But there are users affected across Europe. For example, we have thousands of German wind turbines. These have been remotely serviced by using the system, and this was no longer possible. Now, of course, this is not a dramatic impact, but we can easily imagine other scenarios, and we have cyber attacks in the past that caused economic and physical damage worldwide. So spillover is a real risk. And of course, with spillover, always also comes risk of misperception, because sometimes it's really hard to tell. I mean, in this case, it's easy to tell what was the original intended target. In other cases, much more difficult to tell. Another factor that seems to drastically reduce escalation control is the growing use of proxies and cyber vigilantes. I mean, this is not a new topic. Of course, we talked about the use of proxies mostly in the context of authoritarian countries, how they use proxies to have some level of plausible deniability, to conceal their cyber activities. For example, Russia was often accused, and for good reasons, for using cyber criminals and instrumentalizing them, using them also as a sort of strategic weapon against Western economies. So this whole debate of ransomware. But now, and this is unprecedented, we have these efforts by the Ukrainian government to create what they call an IT army of Ukraine, so openly to call for the support of private hackers worldwide. Of course, this is understandable. If you have a government and a society fighting for its very existence against a brutal invasion, it's completely understandable that you want to use all available means. But nevertheless, I would say this sets a dangerous precedent. And it will be, I guess, emulated in the future. And the questions, and it raises a couple of questions. Who is coordinating these activities? Who is making sure that these private hackers are not going after a really critical system? I mean, when we look, for example, at some of the hackers who affiliate themselves with the Anonymous Collective, we see that some of them claim to go after Russian critical infrastructures. To be fair, most hackers who associate themselves with Anonymous do rather symbolic attacks, so DDoS attacks, website defacements, but some go after more critical targets. A similar question is what are the targets that private hackers are going after and that are organized in this IT army? And there's also a question in terms of the cyber norm debate here, because there has been a multi-year effort to strengthen the principle of state responsibility for private hacking attacks that originate from state territories. There is a multi-year effort to strengthen the principle of due diligence. I think now it will become much more difficult for Western states in the future to argue that there is this responsibility and we need to strengthen this commitment to really prevent private hacking attacks or to stop them. Because for now, it doesn't seem that a lot of, for example, Western governments explicitly say, well, we want to discourage our citizens to participate in these kind of crowdsourcing, offensive cyber crowdsourcing efforts. The US recently issued such a statement, but nevertheless, I think the impact will be felt in terms of the cyber norms debate. And there is a third troubling tendency or development observable, I think, or I'm sure a lot of you came across this deep fake video of President Zelensky apparently announcing military defeat and calling his troops to go home. But there's also another incident where apparently private hackers managed to gain access to a website of the Russian Emergency Protection Agency and posting a message that basically warns Russian citizens of an imminent nuclear attack by NATO around Eastern. So this was deleted. So the message didn't reach a huge audience, but we can of course think of scenarios where this would be different. And I also think this will be emulated, this practice will be emulated in the future. And this combination of hacking and disinformation is much more worrying, I would say, than disinformation via social media alone. To sum up, what are key takeaways? I think there's no denying that we have seen serious cyber incidents, but there is a question about their military significance. This is an open question, it will remain an open question. But I think when we assess the role of cyber operations, we always need to be aware of strategic circumstances, particularly strategic circumstances, and they may change. They might not apply to other cases. So whenever we say that cyber doesn't play a major strategic role in this conflict, it doesn't necessarily mean that it won't play a major role in contexts in very different circumstances. So a word of caution here. And on the other hand, we should not overlook evidence that supports the notion of a particularly escalation risk that is caused by cyber operations, and we have this evidence before our eyes when we look at the Ukraine war. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Mischa. I think we will just hand over directly to Andrea and see how this might be linked to the space dimension and what we can learn about that.
Yeah, thank you very much. Greetings from Munich to everyone out there. Thank you so much for the kind introduction and the invitation, and especially the opportunity to talk about the space dimension today. Similar to Mischa, I will start with a few general remarks. There will be some demystifying on my part. Then I will briefly go into what we've seen in Ukraine so far and what the major implications are for me, what I've done in my research. So for most of you, it might not really be a surprise, but space has certainly become increasingly part of the political public debate in recent months and years. So from a Western Alliance point of view, the creation of the US Space Force by the Trump administration in 2019 certainly brought the military dimension of space into focus. And while this decision was certainly ridiculed, and I'm sure most of you have watched a Netflix series of the same name, it reflects the growing relevance and dependency of modern militaries and societies on space-based capabilities and services. And in this context, it is also noteworthy to acknowledge that, for example, China or Russia had taken similar steps and centralized the military space capabilities and expertise even earlier than the United States did. So what we currently witness is an international trend of pooling military space-based capabilities, services, and expertise, which was also demonstrated in Europe, for instance, in Great Britain, in France, and lastly, also in Germany, when the Bundeswehr established a German space command under the control or under the responsibility of the German Air Force last year. And the reason behind this is that space represents an important strategic enabler as high-tech armed forces have become progressively more dependent on an unhindered access to space and the free use of its space-enabled services, for instance, for secure communications, intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance, or real-time positioning, navigation, and timing, for instance. And since I can see many experts in our audience today, the relevance of space is certainly not new, information for most of you. However, the current debates focus on warn of an impending militarization of space, but certainly fail to recognize that the domain was used for military purposes early on during the Cold War and can be considered militarized ever since. And this widespread misconception notwithstanding, such growing concerns underscore that the conditions for using space are changing, and that we indeed face a looming weaponization of space. So I think there's a real concern for that, and I will go into that a little bit later on. So for me, it's always important to highlight that it is important to acknowledge that the characteristics of space or the characteristics of the space dimension have changed significantly over the last couple of years, which of course have certain ramifications for the military use of space that we will look into. So first of all, space has become more international and more crowded. So while during the Cold War, space technology was mostly confined to only a handful of states, today more than 70 states have active military or civilian space programs, and more than 10 states actually possess launching capabilities. Furthermore, or the second trend I'd say is that space has become widely commercialized as the former monopoly of states over space technology is eroding in favor of commercial actors such as Elon Musk, and we will talk about him in a minute, who are now the central drivers of innovation in the field of space technology. The third trend would be that space has become increasingly congested, since not only the number of actors in space is increasing, but also the number of satellites in orbits continues to rise dramatically, and we will see a sharp increase once all mega constellations projects, for instance, Starlink, are fully underway. And lastly, space is becoming more and more contested as these geopolitical rivalries that we witness here on Earth, particularly between the United States, China, and Russia, extend to space. And this trend can be seen in the field of civilian research. It can be seen in attempts to boost national space industries and innovation, as well as in the modernization of national military space programs, and thereby also in the development of so-called counter space technologies. And yet, despite these trends, which certainly increase the risk of accidental collusion, the risk of misunderstandings and conflicts in space, the framework of international space law has fallen behind the political and especially the technological developments. So while the Outer Space Treaty of 1967 and a few following agreements lay down the basic principles of state behavior in space, the development, the testing and use of counter-space technologies are not regulated except for placing nuclear weapons, but also other weapons of mass destruction into space. But apart from that exception, weapons of mass destruction in space, anything is fair nowadays when it comes to development of counter-space technologies. And the current state of under-regulation and the lack of international consensus indeed paves the way for a new arms race, which we are kind of witnessing already today. This lack of regulation became also apparent in November 2021, when Russia tested a direct ascent anti-satellite weapon by targeting and destroying one of their satellites. This so-called ASAT test caused certainly headlines as the generated debris posed a threat to the International Space Station and was hence internationally condemned, but it did not break international law. And that was something that currently also within the United Nations, we are trying to come up with rules and norms and principles for responsible behavior in space. The war in Ukraine in particular further underlines the importance of space as a military dimension. First of all, even before the invasion actually began, satellite images enabled the world to see and follow Russia's troops movement to the Ukrainian border, to the Ukrainian-Russian border in the run-up to the invasion. Second, as Mischa has already pointed out, on the very first day of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, Viasat, a provider of satellite internet, became the target of an apparent cyber attack, which also affected the communication of the Ukrainian armed forces. It is also reported, as in previous conflicts, that Russian troops are using jamming devices to block GPS signals in conflict. And lastly, and this is something I think we have not seen to this extent or to this degree yet, is that private actors have stepped up and provide open source intelligence and other critical space-based services to Ukraine, be it by sharing satellite data that Kyiv uses to navigate its drones, or like Elon Musk's Starlink by providing satellite internet to Ukraine against Russian attempts to cut communication lines over Ukraine. And all these examples demonstrate that, for me especially, that conflicts on Earth either start or extend to the space dimension. And this certainly corresponds with the characterization of space as a warfighting domain by the United States, but also by many other powerful space actors. So what we've seen in Ukraine and previous military conflicts, certainly on a more low-key scale, will be the norm rather than the exception in the future. And another important conclusion for me is that civilian and military reliance on space might be an opportunity that we certainly profit from or benefit from on a daily basis, but it also poses or represents a significant vulnerability. And while this is of course nothing new, it will become harder to ignore in the future. And as a consequence, militaries will have to adapt with regard to its strategy, with regard to their doctrines, with regard to training and exercises, and especially with regard to the acquisition of space-based capabilities. And these space-based capabilities and services must then be, of course, considered critical infrastructure and may be protected and especially be made resilient against attacks accordingly. Furthermore, states and the international community will have to take into account the future role of commercial actors in military conflicts, as they too will likely become military targets. And this is a circumstance that will not only raise legal questions, but it will be even more important against the background that NATO has, for instance, reinforced at the very beginning of the war that attacks to, from, and within space indeed represent a clear challenge to the security of the alliance and could trigger Article 5. So the role of commercial space actors will be something that the international community will have to deal with. And finally, and this is always the paradox thing, I think, space constitutes a very limited resource for mankind to use. We need a broad international consensus regarding state and private activities in outer space to reduce the potential for conflicts and preserve the long-term sustainability of space. And even though a legally binding treaty under international law is unrealistic in the foreseeable future, I think banning kinetic asset tests that generate space debris, as has been proposed by the United States in response to the Russian asset test in 2021, could be a starting point, as it represents, I think, the lowest common denominator to finally find some kind or reach some kind of consensus when it comes to keeping our space safe, secure, and sustainable. But as I said, I think what we've seen in Ukraine so far is not really something new, but it will be the norm rather than the exception in future conflicts. And with that, I would give back to Anja, and I'm looking very much forward to the discussion in the next couple of minutes. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Andrea, for this really comprehensive picture, I think, despite the very short time frame. So that was very helpful and enlightening, at least to me. I hope to the audience as well, but I'm sure of it.
I hope so too.
Great. I will hand over to Neil now and the uncrewed weapon systems. I can see a first question in the Q&A function. For Mischa, maybe you can read through this already. It's on deterrence and risks of cyber attack. But yeah, we will answer that later on. First of all, Neil, over to you.
Okay, good afternoon all. Hello from sunny Hamburg. As Anja said, I'm here to talk about combat drones and loitering munitions, what they are, what they do, and why they're valued. Both technologies are currently in use in Ukraine, so I suppose this discussion is quite a timely one. Apologies in advance. I'm still recovering from COVID, so if I'm a little incoherent or coffee, that will be the reason. So firstly, what are they? What are drones? What are loitering munitions? And I'll start with drones and try to do this quickly just in case some of this is painfully basic. Drones are aircraft of varying size that do not have a pilot on board and are instead controlled by someone on the ground. Unlike missiles and other aerial projectiles, drones are typically intended to be reused rather than simply rammed into a target. Most drones are not in and of themselves weapons, although they can be obviously equipped to carry weapons of different sizes. And this is important. A large number of technologies, many quite different from one another, fall under the broad description of drones. There are very tiny models that can be purchased off the shelf at a relatively low price. And then you have models like the Global Hawk, which weigh almost 7 tons with 130-foot wingspan and cost somewhere up to $222 million US. There's also plenty of variety in a military context. In addition to key differences in altitude, endurance, and cost, different drones have different functions. And the best way to think about this is a collection function and a delivery function. The former refers to the collection and recording of images and data from the external environment. In war, this collection function can facilitate actions such as surveillance, reconnaissance, targeting, etc. But drones can also have a delivery function. They can deliver payloads, food, medicine, commercial packages, or on a battlefield, missiles. Some drones can only do one of these features, collection or delivery, while others can do both. So why use armed drones in war? What's their value add? I should firstly point out, as Anja mentioned at the beginning, despite being frequently referred to still, I think, as an emerging technology, drones are no longer a new addition to the battlefield. The first combat strike with an armed drone is now decades old. And today, over 100 militaries have some level of armed or unarmed drone capability. And a growing number of states have experience using these systems in combat. So why is there an interest? Well, beyond their well-documented surveillance capabilities, we can divide the military application of drones into 3 categories: fighting, hunting, and protecting. Firstly, armed drones can be deployed to help states better fight and win inter and intrastate conflict. We saw this relatively recently in the 44-day war between Azerbaijan and Armenia. Azerbaijan won a swift and commanding victory, aided by the utilization of medium altitude, long endurance drones. Also loitering munitions, which we'll get to. Azerbaijani drones provided significant advantages in ISR, intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance, as well as long-range strike capabilities. They enabled Azerbaijani forces to find, fix, track, and importantly, kill targets with precise strikes far beyond the front lines. Armed drones were operationally integrated with attacks from manned aircraft and land-based artillery. They also frequently use their own ordnance to destroy various high-value military assets. Reporting suggests that drones contributed to disabling a large number of Armenian tanks, fighting vehicles, artillery units, and air defenses. Their penetration deep into the battle space also weakened Armenian supply lines and logistics. So when used effectively, they can be pretty handy, to put it mildly, but not, and I think this is important, a revolutionary game changer, as some would have you believe, or some newspaper headlines would occasionally state. The Azerbaijan-Armenia conflict is just as much a story of inadequate air defense as it is of dazzling drone power, probably more so, in fact. Armed drones may also be used to hunt and kill people in either personality or signature strikes. Super quickly, personality strikes are undertaken against individuals identified prior to targeting. Signature strikes, in contrast, function on a pattern of life analysis. They target individuals on the basis of their conduct, but their identities aren't necessarily known. And these strikes have been used both within and beyond armed conflict settings, with the latter generating significantly more moral and legal controversy. I'm happy to expand on why if you'd like. And then lastly, armed drones may be employed on actively contested battlefields as a means of force protection, providing overwatch in the form of close air support for troops in combat. And this protective function was the primary justification used by German advocates for armed drone acquisition. I think it's probably uncontroversial to say that aspect of drone use is probably the least problematic, morally and legally, but again, we can discuss this. I should also briefly say that my own work on drones focuses primarily on the moral and legal dimensions of the technology rather than technical dimensions and the efficacy in battle, though of course these issues are connected. Just to forewarn you, if I get a particularly technical question, I'll probably just get a nosebleed and feign connectivity problems, but only time will tell. So moving on to loitering munitions. While some people group this technology with drones, I think that's probably quite misleading. It obscures more than it illuminates. They're actually best thought of as occupying their own category of weapon closer to a smart missile than an aircraft. Like a missile, these systems are consumable. Loitering munitions are one-time use weapons designed to find a target and crash into it, giving it its kamikaze nickname. Once airborne, loitering munitions can hunt for a target by a human-driven process or engage a designated target autonomously, or a combination of these methods. Once airborne, the system is designed to loiter, thus the name, for an extended time, and this loiter time varies between models. Some being used in Ukraine right now can stay airborne for 30 to 60 minutes, while some Israeli systems can loiter for up to 9 hours. Loitering munitions can be an important tactical tool for destroying critical military equipment. They're also portable. That means they aren't reliant on airfields or large open areas to operate. Similar to handheld javelin anti-armor systems, the man-portable nature of most loitering munitions allows small units to discreetly deploy the weapon across the battlefield. So ideally, you're going to use loitering munitions to knock out valuable, expensive material relatively cheaply. And this is obviously going to hurt the adversary directly. The vulnerability experienced as a consequence of loitering munitions is also ideally going to create some tactical headaches for the adversary as they operate in hostile territory. In regards to value, it's also important to mention risk reduction, a long-standing goal in war. One benefit of both drones and loitering munitions is that they allow combatants to further distance themselves physically from the enemy, and by extension, the threat of injury and death projected by the enemy. So on to Ukraine, where both these technologies have featured. I think it's important to firstly point out the obvious. Ukraine is not a drone war, primarily. It's not a war of emerging technologies, primarily. The overwhelming majority of injury and death in Ukraine is being inflicted via technologies like artillery, weapons that have long existed and long been used in a way comparable to how they're currently being used. I sometimes think we have this obsession with finding our own little angle on a conflict, and I think it's important to accept that while emerging technologies have a role in what we're seeing, they're probably not the dominant thing to consider. The kind of abject, vile, systemic war crimes by Russia is probably something that should occupy more of our time. But anyway, drones and loitering munitions are best understood and appreciated as a tactical tool, one that can be utilized by Ukraine to destroy critical Russian military equipment. But these are not technologies in all likelihood that will by themselves turn the tide of the war. Drones are currently being used by both Russians and Ukrainians in this conflict for intelligence gathering and attacks. Capitalizing on the fact that Russia has failed to take full control of the airspace, Ukraine has had some success using a Turkish model of drone, the Bayraktar. I hope I didn't cock the pronunciation of that up too much. There is an ongoing debate over exactly how effective these drones have been against Russian forces, specifically whether this is more a case of Ukrainian drone success or Russian military failure, probably both. Russia's military campaign has been marked by significant failure to provide adequate logistical support, failure to properly prepare for Ukrainian resistance, failure to establish air superiority. And it's still an open question as to whether we would have seen the drone successes that we have seen had the Russian military operation been better run. But again, this is in all probability fairly early in the conflict. So, you know, a lot of this is still ambiguous as to what the answer is. But remember that Ukrainian drones, as well as Russian models, the Orion and the Ulan, are vulnerable to air defenses and drone detection. Their utility will be more limited where air defense cover is more comprehensive. As the conflict goes on, we are also likely to see more use of smaller drones for attacks. If Russia seeks a permanent occupation of the Donbas region or continues with the kind of urban warfare that we've seen so far, Ukraine will continue to resist asymmetrically, and this will likely lead to an increasing reliance on established insurgent tactics. This may include IEDs, but also, like we saw in Iraq, Syria, and elsewhere, smaller drone attacks, both weaponized Ukrainian-made drones and repurposed commercial drones. These small, cruder drones will also continue to be used for intelligence gathering and situational awareness. So again, none of this is a game changer necessarily. Very few things in war are a game changer, but these drones are a relatively cost-effective way to degrade Russian forces. Moving on very quickly to loitering munitions, which have been in the spotlight recently. The US announced in March that it was sending 100 Switchblades, a type of loitering munition. I realized I sometimes struggle to say loitering munition. If I say it too fast, it just comes out in a horrible slur, so apologies. But the latest information I've seen suggests that it's now up to 700 Switchblades. Russia is also not new to the loitering munition business. They have the Lancet system, which they've previously employed in Syria. This is a loitering time of around 30 to 40 minutes. So one of the issues raised by these weapons relates to autonomy. How autonomous can these systems and technologies get before they pose moral and legal problems on the basis of that autonomy? And this, of course, links to the broader ongoing debate over autonomous weapons, or killer robots, as they're sometimes termed. I won't go into this too much right now, but I'm happy to talk about it in the Q&A if anyone would like to talk about it. But I do think conflicts like this highlight an ongoing question over the severity of the challenge. I think a lot of people quite reasonably point to, I don't know how you put it, the more traditional ways of committing atrocity on the battlefield. You know, when you have systematic rape and the direct targeting of civilians by Russians, you know, a lot of people can understandably say, why are we focusing on this nuance of autonomy? And how important is the challenge of autonomy when stacked against some of the vile conduct that we've actually seen, which is, you know, more reminiscent of some of the warfare we've seen over the past hundreds of years. My own position is that autonomy still matters. War can always get uglier. And there are different ways a war can get ugly. You know, we can also have dispassionate forms of problematic violence rather than just sort of abject war crimes, which are bad, obviously, by themselves. But again, I'm happy to talk more about this. But to conclude this little overview, expect to see more of both technologies, armed drones and loitering munitions, in future battlefields, particularly if they come close to meeting the expectations set for them in Ukraine. Also expect those facing these technologies to adapt accordingly. The adversary doesn't sit still. But like I said, these technologies aren't game changers, or they're probably best not thought of as game changers. And they aren't silver bullets either. They have uses and they have limits. And the Ukraine conflict is likely to showcase both. And I'll wrap it up there, but thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Neil. I'm glad you got through this talk without too much coughing as well. Yeah, thanks so much to all three speakers for those presentations. I think by now we have a pretty good picture of how these technologies add to the current conflicts, but that they don't change them by nature or as a game changer, as Neil put it. So beware of the hype, I guess. I would like to start with the first three questions we received. There was two more, but I think we'll take the three first questions and then the next set. The first one goes to Mischa. You probably read through this already. It's basically about, I won't read it out completely, but it's basically about the deterrence capabilities of cyber warfare. Would you agree that the absence of such a response, so a Western cyber attack as a response to the Russian aggression, is a testament to the fear of escalation? The second question goes to Mischa and Andrea to a certain extent. Why did Russia restrain itself or discipline itself with the use of cyber and space attack capabilities? what I might have heard is that maybe they don't have the capabilities to a certain extent, but maybe they have them and didn't use them. Maybe you can elaborate on that a bit. And to Neil, the role of the switchblade, you elaborated a bit on that already, but I think what's interesting is especially, is it diminishing the morale of the Russian soldiers in destroying hard targets, such as tanks and artillery, or do you think it will only play a minor role? And then with that, I hand over to Mischa.
Yeah, thanks for very interesting questions. Ironically, talking about cybersecurity seems to be a connectivity problem here. I don't know if you noticed. I mean, as long as you can hear me, it's okay. If not, I would switch off my camera. Okay.
We can hear you, yeah.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, what would be the utility of a cyber attack as a deterrent? A cyber attack, Western country doing cyber attacks in Russia? Well, I don't think it would be a good idea, and I would agree. It signifies the aim of not escalating too much. I mean, there is no international agreed threshold on when cyber attacks would constitute an act of war. So this is part of the answer. So if the West would go to attack, let's say, military logistics, IT system in Russia, it's an open question whether this would be regarded as an act of war. I mean, from a legal point of view, for now, NATO is not at war with Russia, right? And I think there is no interest to change this. From a strategic point of view, would a cyber attack against Russia really help the Ukrainian defense effort? I think no, because it would be very difficult to make a difference on the ground. It might even help the Russian narrative by providing, a story of, let's say, reckless Western attacks on Russian systems, because as I've said, it's always very difficult to precisely attack only a military component. Many systems are used by both military and civil users. So in my view, the risk would clearly outweigh the utility, and there are dangers. And in general, I don't think that cyber attack is a good way of deterrence. I think a majority of experts, as far as I know, are also very skeptical about deterring any kind of conventional or military action by cyber attacks. Should I go into the second question? Or
yes,
yeah?
please. Yeah.
Okay. So the second question was this puzzle of Russian restraint. Well, I don't think, of course, I don't think that there's any inherent constraint in terms of the general Russian approach when it comes to cyber. I mean, we have seen major cyber attacks coming from Russia in recent years. Ukraine was even used as a sort of test bed for cyber warfare by Russia. I think there are, it's all about the specific strategic circumstances. I think the most important issue to me seems the relationship between physical violence and the utility of cyber attacks. So as I've said, once you're ready to use and willing to use massive physical violence, you can basically afford to not attack via cyberspace. As I've said, cyber attacks are far less reliable and not even cost effective and efficient in comparison with physical attacks. There are other explanations out there, of course, and one is related to this high level of paranoia, obviously, within the Kremlin, but also this illusion of a quick victory. So under the assumption, and this seems to have been the assumption that there's going to be a quick victory and occupation of Kiev, cyber operations do not really contribute to this. And cyber operations against critical targets with physical effects take months of preparation. So in the moment this illusion was kind of showed itself wrong, and Russia realized that it's going to be a much longer war effort, there's not enough time to switch off and to then prepare these kind of cyber attacks in only a few days. So this is also one part of the explanation. And the third part to me seems to be, I mean, Russia, of course, is already internationally almost completely isolated. And I think the Russian leadership has no real interest in internationalizing the conflict further. And this is also, of course, motivating some sort of restraint, because as I said, there's always the risk of cascading effects of cyber attacks spilling over to targets, unintentionally spilling over to systems within Western countries. So different reasons, but I don't think there's any inherent restraint, so to speak.
Thank you, Mischa. Andrea, same question, space dimension.
Okay, thank you very much. I think perhaps one general remark and two possible explanations. So the general remark is what we've seen with regard to jamming, for instance. It's rather low-key, temporary, and confined regionally. We have seen that in the past, and that's something we also see when it comes to the war in Ukraine. So here, Russia is certainly making use of its capabilities. That being said, however, I think we don't have a clear picture, or perhaps we even overestimate the capabilities that Russia actually has with regard to its space capabilities. We know it's at a certain disadvantage when it comes to resolution, when it comes to remote sensing capabilities, when it comes to its own GPS alternative, GLONASS. So here we see Russia is at a disadvantage when it comes to space capabilities, at least in this reversible and regional confined spectrum as well. And this is partly due to the fact that the sanctions after the illegal annexation of Crimea really hit the space industry and the space sector for in Russia very hard. And so the competitiveness of the Russian industry and the innovation was kind of hindered. The reasons why we have not seen more action in this regard is, on the one side, and I think that's the most logical explanation, of course, Ukraine has no satellite fleets on its own, but is totally dependent on data provided by the US, by allies, by private commercial actors. And we have seen in the past, or especially in the context of this war, that, for instance, the American Ministry of Defense, the DoD, and the intelligence agency really try to enable a help or a support from these private commercial actors. That being said, since Ukraine has no satellite systems of their own or on their own, Russia has not dared to openly attack or to openly perhaps even destroy a satellite system that is licensed or operated in the United States, because that would certainly be another different kind of confrontation that both sides try to avoid in this regard. And perhaps I could go, I hope that answers the question. And the second thing is regarding the question of militarization and weaponization. I would also just go on and answer this question, if that's okay with you, Anja. So as Pamela rightly pointed out, space is a strategic enabler and a force multiplier. And ever since the Cold War, so the basic assumption, and this is a debate that is particularly being held in the United States, that space has already been militarized. So what we should focus on is the development of counter-space technologies, which are on the rise. So in a narrow sense, when you speak of weaponization, you can think of placing weapons in outer space. This is one aspect that especially Russia and China are really focusing on the international stage when they want to prevent an arms race. But generally speaking, or in a more broadly sense, the weaponization of space includes everything related to counter-space technologies. And there you have a wide spectrum that is currently being tested, that is currently being developed, and also partly operated. So on a more low-key level, as Mischa has pointed out, satellites or cyber attacks against satellite systems, measures of electronic warfare like jamming, for instance, they are already in practice. I'd say they're already being taken into the battlefield. What the current discussion is about the rather worrisome developments. I have mentioned the acid test by Russia that generated debris. So whenever you get the capability to really, for instance, destroy satellites, in a permanent way that generates debris. You can do that via kinetic asset test, and currently only 4 states really possess that capabilities. But for instance, directed energy weapons are being developed and tested also in other countries, which can also generate debris. So when you think of the weaponization of space, I think right now it is important to focus actually on anything that can generate debris. And I think there we are nearing some kind of international consensus, hopefully. But the problem currently is that due to the dual use nature of space systems in general, so anything you can launch into space and that you can navigate, for instance, can be used as a weapon. So here we need a clear definition of what constitutes a space weapon or even not. And I think that is one of the main problems we currently face when it comes to the weaponization of space. But I'd argue that we have to focus not just on a narrow sense in terms of placing weapons into space, but in focus on trying to really ban the development of counter space technologies in general, or curb the development.
Thank you so much, Andrea. And yeah, it was really helpful to add the second question as well. If I might add, it's really nice to see a couple of familiar names in the Q&A, but also in the participants list. So hi to everyone again. Neil, there popped up a couple of questions also directed at you. So maybe we can add them. It's not just about especially the moral effect of the Switchblade and smaller drones, but there's also a question on the legal framework. Is there any approach for a legal framework regarding completely autonomous and weaponized drones or laws in general? Especially since the AI Act of the EU can't integrate military AI, as we know, and the NATO doesn't do that as well. May I add another question? Are you up to that? And then I can think we should slowly come to an end looking at the time. Does the military in the Ukraine have this sufficient capability of guiding the drones in combat situations? So the question is basically, are those drones piloted from Ukrainian forces or from NATO countries, which of course would be interesting with regard to being a party of war. So I hope you have a good answer to that. Neil, over to you.
The shocking revelation I'm about to drop, that's going to cause World War III. Okay, so I'll start with the first question. Do I believe the Switchblade will be extremely beneficial? I'm not entirely sure how to quantify extremely beneficial in contrast to somewhat or marginally beneficial, but certainly beneficial. I definitely think so. And yeah, I think it could have a morale effect. The degree to which I think is something of an open question. Part of it will be is the question of rights, taking out hardware. But I also think it's probably useful to think about it in terms of the general vulnerability of the battlefield. You know, there's certain aspects of the battlefield where you have pockets of safety and then you move into areas of higher danger. I think things like loitering munitions and drones to a degree can transforming the battlefield more so into a sort of realm of pervasive dread. The idea that there are actually a relatively few safe moments and safe spots. These technologies, when used effectively, can add to the impression that you're forever vulnerable. And you know, the dread that actually creates and sustains, I think can have a damaging effect on morale. Especially when there's a side whose heart isn't really in it in the first place. You know, I would think of this more in terms of sort of nudging than turning a high morale army into a low or non-existent morale army. But I think this aspect of morale, it also links to the use of drones by other Western powers, including the United States. One of the major criticisms of this use in places like Waziristan and elsewhere is that having drone operations for long periods of time above villages and towns and whatnot creates this very thing, this dread effect, because you never feel safe, you never relax, and it can actually cause dramatic psychological harm. So when we're talking about the limits and some of the negative aspects of these drone use, including drone use by us, I think we actually should talk about this notion of general vulnerability and look at it as a potential sort of trade-off when we're considering the benefits of this technology. I'll leave that there. Onto the legal question. Yeah, I mean, there are obviously efforts ongoing to try to create some kind of legal roadblocks, legal controls over autonomous weapon systems, including at the United Nations during the CCW process. This has been going for some years now. And I guess whether you talk to optimists or pessimists, it's either gone poorly or extremely poorly. So yeah, there's been efforts like there's been recent proposals by like the ICRC, for example, who put forward actually a fairly coherent set of measures into how to control this thing. I don't think I'm someone who believes every single aspect of autonomy is inherently problematic, but I do think when you're using something approaching full autonomy to target humans, you necessarily run into some problems. Actually determining delineating between combatants and non-combatants, between legal and illegal targets, is often, you know, tricky business. And there's a fair degree of subjectivity to this, to work out when a human is hors de combat, when out of the fight, or when a civilian is now into the fight. You know, these are very sort of fine details on occasion, and I think autonomy can complicate this. And to actually depend upon them for these finer calls is probably asking too much of them, certainly the autonomy we're currently seeing. And then the final question regarding, also just very quickly on the legal point, there's activists right now trying to create legal measures, again, to control autonomous weapon systems. And I think those efforts are important, but I think it's also important to remember that even if their dreams come true and we get a legal framework controlling autonomous weapons, that doesn't deal with every problem of autonomy. There are a whole bunch of moral challenges that by their nature can't be legally regulated. You know, I think we need to talk more about the risks of dehumanization when we move down certain technological paths, and the idea of war by convenience and, you know, war by pest control, as we've seen in some forms of counterterrorism. Again, this doesn't really relate to Russia and Ukraine, where there's a whole bunch of different and severe problems, but I think it's important to remember. And final point on whether these drones are being launched from NATO countries. Christ, I hope I hope not. Not to my knowledge, I would say. But there are important, I think, strategic ambiguities about drone use that we still don't have a clear sense of. I always look back at the Iranian strike against the Global Hawk, and a bunch of people in the Trump administration pushing him to violently retaliate in response to the shooting down of that drone. And in the end, he erred on the side of restraint, which is like, thank Christ, given it's Trump. You know, and his argument was that, no, there wasn't a human operator, there wasn't a human pilot, a human wasn't killed, so it would be disproportionate to kill a bunch of people in response. But I think the issue is that could have gone either way. You know, you can imagine a scenario where maybe non-Ukrainian power shoots down a Russian drone on their border, and there's just a certain uncertainty as to what exactly that necessitates in terms of response. And I think, you know, we work this stuff out by doing various iterations of these actions, and drones in that context are still early enough that there's still some uncertainty there, and that is dangerous. But yeah, I rambled. Thanks.
Thanks. Yeah. Okay, so we have like 1 minute left, being 5 minutes in overtime. Maybe just a quick final, very quick final round, like 1.5 minutes tops per person. Andrea, maybe you want to just quickly answer the technical questions. I think there were some issues there. And what I really like is also what's about other countries. Like, is there any information on the role of other countries, like from Africa, from African countries? Should that be a topic for the future? I think it should be, also because we have 1 minute left now. And a very interesting question from Johannes Ahlefeld: are there any indications that Putin's miscalculations with a view to the lack of a Western response was related to the perception that he had a strategic military advantage through deployment of hypersonic air and submarine weapons? That's not really what we discussed here today, these technologies, but maybe you want to give your overall impression on that as kind of a final comment, and then some final remarks from me, and then we close the session. 1 minute, Mischa, there you go.
Yep, I mean, perhaps on the issue of what role for other countries, I mean, that's a big question, of course. but I would say, yeah, I think cyber dimension would turn out differently in other countries, of course, because I think, at least for now, we have seen things like manipulation of elections. For example, the whole Cambridge Analytica scandal actually started in Kenya, not in Europe or in other places. So I think the marginal position of many developing countries within the data economy is actually a security risk, but it's not directly connected to cyber attacks. And the other thing is, part of the explanation why a lot of these Russian attacks in Ukraine didn't succeed is because of the strength of the Ukrainian defense and because of international assistance. Companies like Microsoft, for example, US agencies, many years before the invasion, they started capacity building and helped to build up Ukrainian cyber defenses. So this is, of course, is not the case in many, many other parts of the world. So we need to make sure to really step up capacity building in terms of cybersecurity, to increase the level and the quality of cyber defenses also in many other parts of the world. I think this is a core lesson, because Ukrainian cyber defenses have been really remarkable.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Andrea.
Okay, two very quick answers to the questions regarding space. First of all, to Johannes Ahlefeld. I can give you the recommendation if you're interested in that topic, go to the Secure World Foundation or CSIS Aerospace Center. There you get an yearly update of all the possible tests. Also with regard to your question, the co-orbital asset systems that are currently being developed and being tested. So there you get an update of all the open source or based on the open source data that we have. So we know these systems are being developed by Russia, China, and the United States, and even France has hinted at it that it might develop something like that. But so far as I know, only Russia was able to test a co-orbital anti-satellite weapon. And this relates me to the question of Tobias Oldenburg when he asked about the SJ-21. So that has been a Chinese satellite that seemed to be able to kind of grab a satellite of its own and drag it to a so-called cemetery orbit. And this is what I meant with the difficulty of distinguishing between a military use and a civilian use, because of course, in a civilian sense, being able to remove something like a defect satellite or space debris is a very, very good idea. And many companies and states are working towards getting better in this regard, but anything in this regard can be also considered a weapon. So this is again one of the prime examples when it comes to the dual use nature of space systems and the problems and challenges it poses for us. So, and I have talked long enough and very fast, and I give it over to Anja.
Okay, and Neil, very short rambling. And final remarks.
Impossible. I don't think there's any actual direct questions towards me, but there was the question on Putin's miscalculation. That's obviously the question of the day. The one thing I would say about that is that sort of beware monocausal explanations in this regard. Think more in terms of contributing factors, and there are probably a whole bunch of them, some of which don't include us. There can sometimes be a kind of victimhood narcissism and a kind of the idea that everyone's reactive to what we do. I say we as in the West. But yeah, I would say there's a whole bunch of reasons why he's made what I would consider to be such a monumental blunder. But the most important takeaway is that sort of nothing we've done or nothing anyone has done could justify this. This is as textbook unjust war as you can imagine. So yeah, it's wretched.
Perfect final words for this panel discussion, I would say. Thank you so much. So I also, with regard to the time, I won't add anything else when it comes to a conclusion. I think we got a really good picture of what's going on and what is possible at the moment and for what reasons. Thank you to our speakers. It was really enlightening and a joy to have you here. Thank you to Therese Klose and Eva Siegmann, who supported us in the background with all the technical questions. Also, thanks to you as participants for staying with us despite a bit of overtime here. And if you follow the other events from the Bucks Forum on Security Policy, enjoy the rest of the day. And with that, have a good lunch break. Goodbye.